Okay, welcome everybody. So excited to have so many of you join us from different parts of the country. We have people on the East Coast, people in the Midwest and the South, and on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. For those of us that are in the Louisiana, Texas area, definitely sending well wishes to everybody who might be in the path of the storm that's coming through this area, and hope you all remain safe and well. And for our partners on the West Coast, fires, we hope that you are doing safe and being as well as you can given this particular time. Today's conversation I'm really excited to have. We'll be talking about the role that philanthropy can play in terms of impacting Black and Brown communities. We have an awesome a group of panelists today. And just by quick way of introduction, my name is Will Snowden. I'm the director of the Vera Institute of Justice in our New Orleans office. And I'm here with Sarah Mozilla, who's our associate director. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation with some of our partners and friends, not only here in the New Orleans area, but a little bit outside of New Orleans as well. Just quick introductions that I'll go around the window or the screen, and then I'll also invite them to share a little bit about themselves. We have Sebastian Johnson from Arnold Ventures. We have Flozell Daniels from Foundation for Louisiana, Lisa Maria from ALAS, and Dominique Johnson from Daughters Beyond Incarceration. I'd like to begin with Dominique and just ask you to introduce yourself, introduce your organization, and talk about what brought you to do this work that you're doing today.
Hello, everyone. I am Dominique Jackson. I'm the founder of Daughters Beyond Incarceration. DBI started in May of 2018. I was the executive assistant to the chief public defender. And as I was sitting at my desk, my dad called. My dad is currently on his 38th year of a life sentence at Angola State Penitentiary. And I was talking to Derby, who was the chief at the time, and I asked him if it was okay if I could look at my father's case. And so I did. And so I suddenly realized that things didn't add up with the facts that were presented in his case. And I asked my dad, well, what is there something that we can do about it? I don't want to grow up. I don't want my children. I don't want anybody else to grow up lost or feeling confused or experiencing the symptoms that most children experience while struggling with the ACEs suffering from incarceration. And so he said, you need to create a space for girls who are impacted by their parents' incarceration. He also told me who to partner with and why, and that it was okay that I didn't know her, but because he knew her father, that she would be a good person for her. So I contacted Bree Anderson, who is the daughter of formerly exonerated, Robert Jones. And like I said, I had never met Bree. I didn't want to meet Robert. And Bree and I got together and connected. And we've been joined together ever since then. We started out with 2 girls, and now we currently have about 70 girls registered in our program.
Thanks so much, Dominique. Sebastian, I'd like to come to you. If you could just briefly introduce yourself, the organization you work with, and talk to us a little bit about what brought you to this work.
Absolutely, and thank you guys so much for inviting me to participate on this panel with you. So my name is Sebastian Johnson. I'm the Advocacy Chief of Staff at Arnold Ventures, and so I support our advocacy team in making grants in the C3 and C4 space to win policy changes that impact people's lives. Arnold Ventures has a broad portfolio, so we operate in healthcare, higher education, criminal justice, public finance, and then we have a set of exploratory areas as well that we do grant making in. Before starting on the advocacy team, I was a part of the criminal justice initiative at Arnold Ventures, where I oversaw some of our work in the fines and fees space, which is, I think, most directly relevant to this conversation today, but then also working with Vera in the correction space, supporting the Restoring Promising Reimagining Prison programs. What brings me to this work, similar to Dominique, having the experience of a parent who spent a lot of my childhood incarcerated, understanding that public policy can change lives. That's been the reason that I'm in a lot of the spaces that I have been in. I started my career in education, and then came to criminal justice, public funding, tax policy, with the understanding that people have struggles, people have hardships, people make mistakes, but that the ways in which government responds to those mistakes has a profound impact, and that we can do better for families. And so thanks again for having me here, and excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Sebastian. Coming to you, Lisa Maria, talk to us a little bit about yourself, ALAS, and what brought you to this work.
Buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Lisa Maria Rhodes. I'm Colombian American, and my mother came to the U.S. as a single mother in order to give me alas. You see right here, alas means wings in Spanish. I'm a teacher and a social worker, and also did my social work internship at the Public Defender's Office here in New Orleans. And at that time, my very first client at the Public Defender's Office was a student who I had taught Spanish to for 2 years prior. And learning how to do advocacy from inside the Public Defender's Office taught me that when I went back to the same high school as a social worker instead of as a teacher after finishing school for social work, that educators have a significant role that we can play in advocating for our students. And we don't always know how. Systems don't always communicate with one another. So judges, for example, are holding students who are unable to afford bail pre-trial when they have really excellent supports available at school, and judges just have no idea that that's happening. And so that is arm one of ALAS. We train educators to write letters to judges with the goal of having students released on reconnaissance pre-trial, or having their bail reduced to an amount that is affordable so that they can be in school instead of in jail pre-trial, and just have their basic Sixth Amendment right of the presumption of innocence, truly. And then during that time, a lot of students started coming to New Orleans from Central America as unaccompanied minors. This was around 5 years ago. And, when students have an immigration court date and their parents don't, their parents are at risk of deportation if they attend with their student, and so, or with their child rather. So a lot of my students would ask me to go to court with them. And when I went to court with my students, what I realized was there is no public defender in immigration court. And so they're not getting a Sixth Amendment, idea of representation, of legal representation. And there, at the time, there were no interpreters, and there's still not in family court provided interpreters, which is part of the immigration process. So that means, I was going as a teacher, as a social worker, just for moral support, and then judges were calling on me as if I were an attorney, and then I ended up interpreting. And at the time, I was not a certified interpreter. And so seeing those gaps and seeing what the outcomes were, our students who didn't, I started to track it, and our students who didn't have an attorney won their immigration cases 8% of the time. So that means they're almost guaranteed to lose. And I've seen several of my students deported as a result. When you lose your immigration case, that's what happens. You get a deportation order. And then on the flip side, students who do have an attorney are winning their cases at 88% of the time. So we're talking about night and day. So really, I just started by knocking on some immigration attorneys' doors and saying, hi, I'm a high school social worker, and I have this student here, and I'm trying to file for special immigrant juvenile status. Is that the right thing? Is this the right paper? And of course, attorneys are looking at me like, you can't do that, which is the goal. We want to partner with attorneys to work on behalf of our students. And so the second thing that we do is we train educators to connect undocumented students to pro bono or low bono legal representation. Many of my students, as a high school educator, many of my students have dropped out or been pushed out of school because they don't have access to an attorney. It means they're leaving school so they can work, so they can pay for their attorney. It's $5,000 to $10,000 at least to file for special immigrant juvenile status and asylum. And overall, our goal is that whether students are impacted by criminal justice system or immigration system, that neither would be barriers to their education.
Thank you so much, Lisa Maria. I'm going to come to you next, Flozell. Just give us a little background introduction about yourself and the work that you do and why you showed up in this space.
Yeah, good afternoon, Will, and everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here with you all. So I'm Flozell Daniels, Jr., President and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana. And we are a social justice philanthropic intermediary, which is really just a mouthful to say that we get the privilege of working with hundreds of individuals and organizations across the state to invest, build, and act towards freedom work, really thinking about how do we invest in both Louisiana's people and in best practices to make the state stronger through a social justice lens. We have a real racial equity and gender equity perspective, and we've been able to manifest that work over the last 15 years. We were founded a few days after Katrina as a response to the disaster, and the founders were smart enough to know that the storms of racism and gender inequity and LGBTQ bias and all of the things that we know are challenges across the state were storms that hit Louisiana long before Katrina did. And so we've been practicing now for 15 years a way of investing in people, our greatest asset, if you will, and the opportunity for folk to take their experience and their wisdom and to apply it to a public policy practice in a way of changing systems so that they actually work for them and not against them. We've also had the privilege of working to close the racial economic wealth gap by making grants and loans to micro and small businesses, particularly those led by Black and Brown people and women. And we have the privilege of convening folk around strategy work where we get invited in to do that work. And so we've been able to do some intersectional work, not only criminal justice reform, but housing, LGBTQ issues, building wealth in communities, and all of those things, knowing that one touches the other. And we've been doing that work for about 15 years now.
Thanks, Flozell. And Sarah, I'm going to come to you. Just do a quick introduction. Talk to us about why you came to do this work.
Hi, y'all. I'm Sarah Moschel. I'm the Associate Director for the New Orleans office. And similar to Lisa Maria, I came to this work as a teacher. After teaching here in New Orleans in my hometown, I saw a lot of the inequities and saw a lot of my students, being victims of gun violence, being victims of the school to prison pipeline, being arrested out of classrooms, and seeing a lot of the contact that they had with with law enforcement and the criminal legal system. I ended up going to law school and have since just really devoted my work to ending these different forms of oppression. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and really excited about this discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Dominique, I'm going to come back to you before we get into our kind of list of questions, but you said something that I've heard you say before that I understand why you make this statement, but I don't think everybody else does, and that's the statement that you didn't want to meet Robert Jones. And for those of us that know Robert, Robert's an amazing human being. I believe he was, incarcerated for 22 and a half years for a crime he did not commit. And so some of us might be thinking, well, why wouldn't you want to meet Robert? And I just wonder if you could just unpack that sentence a little bit for folks to understand your position.
So like I said, my father is on his 38th year of a life sentence. This November, I'll be 38. He's been incarcerated my entire life. Robert was in jail for 23 years. For 23 years, Robert spent his life getting to know my father. And no one should know my father better than me. As I was the executive assistant to Chief Darwin Bunton, Robert's resume came through, I want to say at least 3 or 4 times. And I don't think they put 2 and 2 together, but I did. And so I deleted his resume every time I saw it, because there was no way possible I could be so vulnerable at work and allow myself to share the same space with someone who knows my father more than me. And it hurt. And although I ignored all of the calls my dad made to me, asking me to introduce myself to Robert and to get to know Robert, the one day I got off the elevator and got to work early, and he was sitting in the lobby trying to figure out why he had never heard a response, I knew it was him. And I went back to my office, pacing back and forward, because there was no way they were going to hire someone who knew more about me than me. I mean, Robert knew when I went to puberty. Robert knew my different hairstyles. He knew about my different track meets. He knew so much about me because he was so close to my father. And so I must have avoided Robert for about 3 months because I remember meeting Bree at IPNO's gala, and I walked up to her and told her, I didn't like your daddy when I met him. And I knew we were going to either work well together or we were going to fight. So happily we worked well together. And Robert is like a second father to me. So I'm happy that he was patient with me and he understood where I was coming from.
Thanks for sharing that personal story, Dominique. And what you, I think, do such a great job representing are the additional harms of mass incarceration that often do not get talked about. And those are the harms that translate to the families, to the daughters, to the sons, to the support networks of people that are incarcerated. And as you have ventured into this work with Daughters Beyond Incarceration, I was hoping you could share a little bit about some of the barriers that you've identified that have prevented some of the success that you'd like to have on behalf of the communities that you serve.
So a lot of people don't think about what children impacted by incarceration need because they never really think about us. I mean, you hear so many times how when a parent is incarcerated, so is the child, so is the family. If that's true, why don't you come to us when you have a question or when it's time to make a decision? Why don't you invite us at the table when it's time to plan? Include us there in those conversations. And for those reasons, we're not able to get the funding opportunities that are out there for us because we're often overlooked. And or people say, well, they don't have the capacity to fulfill this job. Well, if you give us the funding, if you give us the space, and if you give us the people, then we can create what we need to become successful and to have our organization a sustainable organization for not just Bree and myself and the current girls that we have, but when Bree and I get tired, those girls can take over and DBI can still be around for so many other girls. And so when you think about how grassroots nonprofits can remain sustainable, you ask yourself, well, why don't we have community organizations at the table? When we have our events, you don't have city leaders at our events. You don't have politicians. You have grandmas, you have aunts, you have uncles, and you have a bunch of beautiful Black and brown kids running around there. And I mean, even through with the caterers, you have startup catering companies, you have startup funding vendors for snacks. It's because we are a true community organization. And sometimes it gets frustrating because organizations will give to those people who say that they do support Black and brown communities or support women and girls, but yet the proof isn't out there. And you'll see organizations like DBI on pictures giving their girls laptops and hotspots or creating some beautiful pictures as you see behind me, but yet we're still overlooked. So some of the things that DBI needs to remain successful and to become sustainable, we need funding, we need space, and we need people.
Thanks, Dominique. Lisa Maria, I'm gonna pose the same question to you. As you think about the population you serve generally, which I would describe as students, obviously there's court-involved students and then students that have involvement with our immigration system. Can you share some of the barriers that you've identified in terms of preventing you from being successful, as successful as you want to be to serve these communities?
Well, the most immediate barriers that prevent students from accessing education if they are impacted by either court system, part of what I described in the beginning in terms of in the immigration system, not having access to a public defender leaves students in a position to either drop out of school in order to work to pay for their legal representation. And so on that side, having public defense and immigration court would be a first step, and in family court as well for immigration court orders. And there's many systemic, I mean, that's one piece, there's many things that come before that. On the criminal court side, having the presumption of innocence. I mean, being able to have a system where we don't have bail set, and like your ability to be free pre-trial is not contingent upon your ability to pay for that. But of course, before that, I mean, I can't tell you, you know, a guest speaker came and spoke one time and asked, raise your hand if you have ever been stopped or profiled by the police. And there wasn't a student in our school who didn't raise their hand. And so the issues are much bigger and more systemic than just money bail. I mean, why are students being arrested whenever their apartment complex is being targeted for something that has nothing to do with them? Why isn't there access to many base issues of like housing, healthcare, and basic needs to be met that would significantly change that barrier that have everything to do with race and socioeconomic status.
Thanks, Lisa Maria. I want to pivot to Flozell and Sebastian. And as we've heard from Dominique and Lisa Maria, you know, one of my takeaways is they're talking about impact on our Black and Brown communities that actually isn't solely focused on what's happening in the courtroom or solely focused on what is directly underneath our criminal legal system. We're talking about families of those that are incarcerated. We're talking about students in our classrooms in our high schools that are having impact by our court system as well. And so I'd love to just to kind of start big picture with you, Sebastian, if you could just share a little bit about why do you give and what is your strategy for impacting Black and Brown communities? And then I'll come to Flozell with the same question.
Yep. So I think what's unique about Arnold Ventures is that, you know, we've been around for 10 years, but we really are still in a startup kind of posture where our strategies are constantly evolving as we and our founders learn more about the world around us and what different ways we can think about impact and also how we can get to systemic change in communities. So I think that our North Star is always going to be policy change. We look at, one, how do we determine what will be the best policy, leveraging data and evidence and research to affect the most lives and produce the best outcomes? And then two, how do we use our resources to develop advocacy strategies that are going to make those policies more likely to pass rather than less likely? I think that one of the things that we're learning as an organization is that, particularly as we moved into the advocacy space, it is a lot easier to set an agenda and a strategy in the space of research or evaluation, where you're working with organizations. There's a scientific method, there's a research process, and you're evaluating, you can compare apples to apples. But in the advocacy space, and what we've learned in the past year, you know, looking at what is happening with COVID-19, what's happening with the uprisings of cities across the country, is that the advocacy space is dynamic. The agenda is driven by communities themselves and people on the street. And so part of the evolution that we're going through is understanding that we need to do advocacy in partnership with community. And that we also need to think about, when we talk about expertise and experience, what are the expertises and experiences that are missing from our current strategy? And I think part of that is going back to what Dominique said, that your lived experience and your ability to be a credible messenger and interact with your community is just as important as having the right data and evidence, particularly when you're developing an advocacy strategy, trying to get a bill passed, trying to get a city council ordinance passed. And so I think going forward, what we're thinking about is not only how do we do the inside game strategy of hiring lobbyists, hiring advocacy organizations who are C4 and have done this work for a long time. How do we connect them to people on the ground who both are closest to the solution because they've been dealing with the problems day in and day out, but also how do we incorporate those stories and those lived experiences into the campaign, because you end up with a stronger, more sustainable footprint in communities when the people who are most affected by your problems are bought in, are at the table, and are seeking common ground to help you find that solution.
Thanks, Sebastian. Flozell, I'd like to get your input as well.
Sure. I think one of the reasons I give and that the way I think about this is as someone who's native born, I'm an uptown kid, you know, born to a teenage mom. And I had a colleague who once told a story about noticing in their childhood that the men were disappearing from their community, right? And you don't see it. It's almost like the novel Watership Down. You don't notice it at first, but over time, you notice that there's something different happening than when you go to school and deal with your white peers whose neighborhoods and families look very different. And I've been fortunate enough to make my way through, you know, great public schools in New Orleans, good education at UNO and Tulane, you know, doing policy work in the mayor's office and legislative work as a legislative sort of liaison for Tulane University. And in all those experiences, it was really clear to me that there are power dynamics driven by race, driven by class, so-called class, that require us to do something really different and to answer this question that Dominique has set forth about why is it that resources that should be going to Black communities, brown communities, to people who are doing the actual work, why isn't that happening? And so part of what brings me to this work and my way of thinking about why we do the work the way we do and what drives me is this idea that we get to attract resources that otherwise wouldn't come to the region. We get to develop strategies that really tell an accurate narrative and to reframe the narrative towards accuracy so that people can understand that we have no history in Louisiana of any great and amazing social justice things happening in our communities and from a policy perspective that Black and brown folk didn't drive. There's just no evidence of it. As far back as you can look, anything good and decent that was created came out of the leadership and experience of our ancestors and our current colleagues. So it just makes strategic sense, but we see those disparities across the nation and certainly in the Deep South, right? Sebastian talked about the South doesn't get a proportional share of resources. Louisiana certainly doesn't. And we think there's a real opportunity to continue to build power with each other, to frame the narrative, to attract more resources so we can actually continue and expand the practice of funding the work where the work is. Now, you know, when you're focused on Black and brown communities, as you should, we think also about networks. If you look back over the last 30 to 50 years, whether it's inside of campaigns or movements or what have you, it seems to me the best way to support that work, and Dominique said it, you need money, you need space, you need resources is what you need. And what you don't need are folk asking, why don't you have those things? And oh, by the way, if you go get them, we will then fund you. There's a very backwards thing here that goes to how philanthropy, quite frankly, is set up as a part of America's system of capitalism. And so in many ways, we're trying to interrogate that, trying to direct as many resources to Black and brown communities, not just because it's the right thing to do. It is certainly a value we have, but because we have learned it's the most strategic thing to do. If you want actual outcomes, you're gonna have to support Black and brown folk, right? We have an expansive and intersectional analysis around that includes Native people, that includes people of Asian descent. Because of the landscape of Louisiana, one has to be nuanced about it. But that's the way we think about this and why our strategies to support Black and brown communities are really simple and elegant and direct. Send money to folks who are doing the work. Hopefully you have enough money to send it to all the folk in this loose network, because usually there's a loose network of people doing the work, so that they can help each other be strong enough, build enough bandwidth, and to be powerful enough to actually impact policy work. What we want, at least in the work that we do, is systems change, not just charity work or not just the one-off win. We want long-term systems change because that works for Black and brown communities.
Thanks, Flozell. And I want to have a quick follow-up. We have almost 80 people on today's Zoom call, and we know some of those people work in philanthropy themselves. Some of them are running nonprofits doing this work as well. And you mentioned this idea that Dominique kind of teed up as this chicken and the egg complex, complex, right? Is that, organizations need money, they need space, they need resources, they need people. And sometimes funders and donors are looking for that to already exist. And so I'm wondering if you could give us your opinions on how do newly formed nonprofits tackle this chicken and egg complex? How do they raise that to the level of discussion for those working in philanthropy? And then separately, like, what are the conversations that need to be happening amongst philanthropy to kind of get away from that idea of already trying to invest in an organization that has those things that seem so vital?
Yeah, well, let me first acknowledge that there are some philanthropies that are actually doing some of that work, who are thinking and actually looking for the folk who are doing the work. So we're seeing a shift in philanthropy over the last 20 years, I would say. And you have organizations like NCRP and others at the national level who are holding accountable philanthropy and really trying to say, you guys have got to do this work. And you have to shift so that you can keep up with the folk that you're making grants to or should be making grants to. With that said, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And it's unfortunate, Will, that we even have to answer that question, but there have to be answers to the question, right? And so I think part of what I've seen as a grant-seeking organization ourselves, we're not endowed, we're an intermediary. And so we, to some degree, really understand what that looks like, even with the privilege that we sit inside of. And frequently, funders are looking for the very best ideas, and you have to have a way of narrating those ideas in a way that creates excitement. So we always offer, sometimes as a technical support, some of the narrative work and way of framing the story, because storytelling still matters in how people make funding decisions. I think funders are looking for strategy. So that network piece that I mentioned, frequently, they not only want to know, well, what are you doing? But they also want to know who else in the area or in the region is working on the same or intersectional issues. Do you all work together? Are they in a position to accept funding? And if so, what does that look like? I think you really need to have an analysis of your landscape that you can explain to funders and draw them into this idea that there's a portfolio there, right? Because whether we like it or not, even deep social justice funders are looking for portfolio opportunities, and they're looking to shape their presentations to their grants committee, to their bosses, in a way that gives confidence internally. And so you've got to meet that standard. And for me, so much of that is about the narrative, is about being able to tell the story. And then to me, the last leg that's really important is being really forward about the operational issues. One of the challenges we have, and I know it's a challenge that our grantees have, we find all kinds of ways around this, is explaining the balance sheet, right? People say, well, if I'm going to give you $100,000 and you've only managed 20, how do I know you're going to be able to do that? I think you have to have an answer for it. And I would engage your board, I would engage your advisors in thinking about telling how you're going to scale, what that scale looks like. That's deep in the management weeds, but it's the kind of thing that we always advise our grantees, who we frequently try to help identify other resources and be a partner in that, right? We're a small funder. You'd be lucky if we make a grant that's $20,000 to $30,000 because we're an intermediary. But some of our biggest bang for the buck comes in partnering to go after larger dollars and making bigger initiatives so that we can draw those resources down and have an aligned strategy that gets us to the kind of justice and freedom we're looking for.
Thanks, Flozell. Sebastian, I was wondering if you could share some thoughts as well. The conversation around this chicken and egg idea, where nonprofits might not already have the people, the resources, the space, but they're trying to get that funding, but the lack of those resources might position their perspective by the funder differently. How are you hearing this discussed within your networks amongst philanthropy, and what do you think the nonprofits should be considering when dealing with that chicken and egg idea?
And that's a great question. I mean, I think it starts in two places. One is that for people who are working in philanthropy, the only choice that you get to make is making the grant. And then you have less and less control over whether or not the work gets done on the back end of that grant. And so I think that incentive makes a lot of grant makers risk adverse, because they know that if they can go to a larger organization that has a proven track record of success, they're going to get, number one, less questions about the organization. So that's going to make it more likely that the grant's approved. And number two, if things do go sour and you're not able to accomplish the objectives of the grant, it's not going to be because you took a risk. It's going to be because of another set of reasons. And so I think that in the philanthropy space, we need to interrogate that and think about, you know, what is the wrong way to give out money? Is kind of the question, right? It's if you make a grant and you don't accomplish your advocacy goals, you don't accomplish the research, but in doing so, you're strengthening the organization, you're learning from the mistakes, you're giving dollars to impacted communities and building leadership in communities. Does that mean that the grant failed? So I think it has to do with how we define success and how we incentivize ourselves to take those risks. I think the second thing is about the structure on the nonprofit side. And I think that just as you see organizations in philanthropy that are dominated by people who attended elite schools, who are white or white passing, who have a certain level of social privilege, you see the same thing on the nonprofit side. And so it is easier, I think, when as strategies shift, as new issues of the day arise, for the organizations who have done the work before to pivot. And so there's also some crowding out on the nonprofit side. There's some, my organization doesn't do this, but I can do it and I can do some sub-grants. That's something that happens. And so I think there's power dynamics that you need to evaluate both on the philanthropy side, on the nonprofit side. And I think that for philanthropies, we have an extra responsibility to think about how we structure our giving and how we structure our internal processes to, disincentivize some of that, to really bring more people in. So I think from one perspective, so for instance, we are a data-driven organization. We place a lot of emphasis on data, research, evaluation. And what I think we could do a better job of is, if those are the competencies and the skill sets that we want to see, how are we developing leadership in community? How are we pairing community-based organizations and people who are working in Black and brown communities so that they can develop those capacities inside? And how can we make that a part of our practice, as well as pushing evidence-based policies? And so I think it's also about thinking through how your strategy can include community, can be done with community, and not just saying, this is what we want, let's go find it.
Thanks, Sebastian. I want to pivot to Dominique and Lisa Maria. As we heard from Flozell and Sebastian about this, their perspective of this chicken and an egg kind of concept, as we are doing fundraising for the work of our organizations. Dominique, I want to start with you. I've gotten to know your work through DBI over the last few years, and am always inspired and moved by the impact that you have on those young girls. And just recently, either you or Bree shared a picture of, it was almost like a before and now picture of one of your mentees. And just seeing that growth and transformation in the girls that you work with is very inspiring. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, what are the things outside of a grant application that you wish a supporter or a foundation interested in supporting your work was actually aware of? It doesn't always fit into the confines of a grant application.
So for those of you who may not know, I just recently had twins. And I told myself that I would give myself maybe 2 months of maternity leave. I didn't. The entire time I was in the hospital, I was working. When I came home, I was working. I had mentees visit me while I was in the hospital recovering. I had mentees stopping by my house while I was recovering. There's no endpoint to helping the youth. The work that we do is on an each one, teach one style of learning, which helps with self-empowerment. So if I tell them no, then I'm not completely being transparent. Because what I want these girls to understand, the value of hard work, self-care, and the importance of advocating for the things that you need to make your life and your community better. And so if I stop working and these girls need to eat, what happens then? Then you may have another girl impacted by the justice system because I wasn't available while she was hungry, while her parent is working 2 jobs. You know, those type of things aren't asked on grant applications. You know, they ask us, like Flozell said, how can you scale that? Like Sebastian said, what data do you have? Well, the data that I have is the grandmother that calls me at 6 o'clock in the morning and says that her child needs a ride to school in the storming rain. The data that I have is that when you go to these parks for NORD, you see nothing but women out there with young boys. The data that we have is that you have Black and brown girls being expelled, suspended, and dropping out of school at a much higher rate than their peers because no one can understand why they are having conflicts with their teachers. Or because you have school teachers currently in New Orleans not understanding why their child or their student is calling me to help them with a problem that they're having with a teacher. Those aren't questions that are asked on an application. And those are some of the reasons why I cannot take time off, because that could possibly affect the child's lifetime just by missing a phone call. I wish that philanthropists would be able to look beyond the application, because you can tell a lot from a photo. You know, I had one girl she is the daughter of one of the Hampton girls. And when I first met her, I asked her how was she doing, and she just broke down and cried. And she said, "Why do you care? No one has ever cared to ask me how am I doing." I don't get those type of questions on applications. I get the questions that want you to create a logic model, which I have no problem in doing. And I have questions that want you to give me your 3 to 5 year projection plans. And then you have some grant applications that tell you, okay, well, we don't provide direct services. It's the direct services that help communities thrive. If you don't provide direct services, then how are you helping the community? I mean, because you have to provide them with housing, you have to provide them with jobs, and you have to provide them or connect them to resources to help them better themselves. So how is it that you don't fund direct services?
Thank you, Dominique. Lisa Maria, I want to come to you. You know, I've had the privilege of seeing your impact on your students even before you founded ALAS. And it's just so inspiring when you give these updates about the students of, you know, how they may have been having particular issues they were navigating while they were in school. And then an update is, oh, they're 2 years from graduating college, or they just got accepted into college. And the art that you're able to broadcast and share is really impactful and really inspiring. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit similar to the question I asked Dominique, is what are the things that don't necessarily get captured by a grant application, but that you would love to bring to the radar of those considering to support ALAS? I think you're muted.
How about now? Okay. When interacting with grantors, or I mean, even any everyday person who's interested in asking, I spend over 50% of the time establishing the problem. Like, we can't talk solutions if we can't agree that there's a problem here. And I'm not sure that without having certain vantage points, people are even seeing the problem. This is true for students who are affected by our criminal justice system, and it is multiplied beyond for students who are impacted by our immigration system. As Dominique mentioned, what does that look like? A call while I'm at morning meeting at school from a student, my house is being raided by ICE right now, and the concern is, you know, you have to be in morning meeting right now. I mean, absolutely. Looking at counseling options or IEPs in schools, are they available to students regardless of their language background? There are many schools that say, we don't have a Spanish-speaking psychologist, so we can't do the evaluation, so we can't do the IEP, so a language access plan is sufficient because that is a differentiation. What if that student has any other need for an IEP? Using any Spanish speaker or speaker of another language as the interpreter or as the translator of documents while they actually have another job. And so teachers are leaving classrooms to go interpret for somebody in the office right now, or someone in the office doesn't have that. I mean, there's a whole system of structures and supports that are necessary for all of our students. Would you send like a English speaking student to the same person for counseling and to figure out their bus routes and when ICE is knocking at their door and to figure out how to apply to college? No, those are different roles altogether. And so I think instead of considering, oh, for immigrant populations, we need one organization or one person that's the hub stop for everything. Absolutely not. We need every specialist to accommodate to every student, because every student needs that support regardless of their language background, regardless of race, class system involvement. And that's a challenge that we need to be asking in every service that we're providing. Do we really accommodate for all? How do we do that? How can we grow in that? And another piece to this is proactivity versus reactivity. I mean, this is the work that Dominique is doing, is working with young girls prior to their adult life to make sure that they have the foundations that they need to be successful. And the same thing on this side, we want our students to have an attorney so that they don't lose their case, so that they don't get deported, or to have this letter written to a judge so that the judge could release them pretrial, because not only does that impact trauma, recidivism, education pre-trial, but it impacts the course of the trial itself, because then they're going to court and they're saying, well, here's my attendance record that's great, and here are my grades, or whatever great things that we have to say is what we send to say this should influence the outcome. But often I'm seeing that you know, we have a fascination with reactivity. Oh, let's give people food, but let's not ask why they're hungry. So focusing first on the proactive solutions, it's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, you can't go take a picture of it all the time, but do we really want to have the problem and respond to it, or do we want to work on the prevention side? And then finally, I would say how to build relationships with organizations and foundations. It's like a whole world in and of itself. And so when you're, you know, a teacher or social worker and you're at school, that is an additional skill set, an additional group of people. It's a new world to navigate, and it seems like there's a good old boys club there too. It seems like, you know, people who know each other, the ones who get the invitation to apply for the grant. So how do you get in that group? That's not transparent. I mean, yeah, with a lot of network, with a lot of support, and with a lot of community partnership, I still don't know how to do that. And so that's very nebulous. And to make that clear, to make like a chart that says, here's how you start. Step one is, you know, email these 5 people, or email the person with this title at every organization in your area. That would be really, really helpful. And so those are some of the things that I think, you know, might go unseen.
Thanks, Lisa Maria. I want to check in with Sarah real quick. And, you know, Sarah, you've been with Vera, you know, since beginning of this year, so not so long, but you've been in this space of working to change not only our education system through your work as a teacher, but the different various positions you've had in terms of advocating for reforming our criminal legal system. And so you've been in this space of applying for grants, trying to get support for work that you're doing. Now, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your perspective of how to highlight and bring to the attention to funders and supporters of the work that you're doing that might not necessarily be captured by a grant application. And there might be, if there's current work that you're working on now, that's a good example of that. I'd love to hear.
So there's so many things that everyone has said that I just agree so much with, especially, you know, Dominique and Lisa Maria just talking about the things that you can't, like, don't fit into the perfect boxes on the grant application. I think sometimes, you know, in past work that I've done, and just to, you know, add a little bit to this or piggyback on it, you know, being able to explain that the work that a small organization is doing is actually solving the problems of a large system, and a large, like, system that's been here for 400 plus years, it's really hard to explain. Like, we're going to provide, you know, for instance, with my previous organization, we're going to provide direct funding to young people, because these young people just are in neighborhoods that don't have the resources and the structures, of, you know, just the lack of investment in different neighborhoods, or the issues that, you know, Flozell was talking about earlier with, you know, families being broken up by this system. And so there's a lot, you know, that is on the shoulders of moms and aunties and uncles to, like, really support young people. So we're going to give them money, and everyone's like, why did they work for it? Did you? And it was like, well, we are doing that because we're taking out the other barriers so that they are, you know, going to school instead of, like, trying to work or find a little, you know, a job here and there. And so it's just really, you know, it's just the system is just so it's uneven. You know, you have small nonprofits fixing large systemic issues. The other thing that, you know, when I, you know, think about things that I really wish that we could uplift in grant applications, is that there are things that are connected. So, you know, the criminal legal system is connected to the school system, which is connected to, like, the housing, which is connected, you know, to where grocery stores are. It's all very connected. And so sometimes you're trying, you know, a grant asks you for a very specific thing, you know, it's a very specific topic. You're like, well, but I have to cut away at this because it's actually an obstacle to me fulfilling this grant, right? So the linkages, one of the things that I was thinking about was when we were talking about getting jobs for young people, or figuring out how are they going to get to their internships, the problem was transportation. Really, we needed a whole transportation grant. Like, they want to go to the job, but they need to be able to get there, and getting there is actually more expensive than this part of the work, right? In the, you know, current work that we're doing, I think something that's lifted up is, you know, we're doing some work around how do we look at how we invest in police in this, across the country, but also in Louisiana. But then how do we think about that in terms of community investment? And what has come up is well, you know, a lot of philanthropy doesn't want to go there yet, right? Because there are all of these different programs that are funded in different ways. And it's just something to start to think about, right? That people have their strategy around how, and people being philanthropy has a strategy about how it moves and how it works. And so it can be really difficult to move outside of that strategy. And if the strategy is how do we do a lot of reform work on the systems themselves, the conversation doesn't necessarily want to be about how do you completely maybe shrink those systems really radically and move to another strategy. So those are some of the things. I also wanted, you know, I saw something in the chat that I think is really, like, kind of opportune to this moment, but there was a conversation about data, right? Like, everybody wants the data, and the data can be more than just numbers. So we should just, like, lift that up. We have a really gifted person in our office who tells us, like, data is more than just numbers. It's a lot of different things, and it costs money to collect data, and it costs money to collect the kinds of data that are really important, like Dominique and Lisa Maria have been lifting up a lot too, and actually Sebastian and Flozell too. So the question that came up is, like, how do you fund the data collection and analysis and provide that support, like you discussed, especially I think I remember Sebastian saying about how do you increase the capacity for that? And so I answered a question and threw some more in there.
Well, if I could respond well, to this point that Sarah makes, I'm over here having, my brain is exploding, right? Because this has been happening since I was a grant maker with the city of New Orleans, more than 20 years ago now. And people say, well, we want the evaluation, we want the data, we want the analysis, right? We say it a lot, we're a data-driven organization. But best I can tell from our funders and in the confines of our capacity, it's almost impossible to get the money to do it and to do it well, especially along the lines that Dominique and Lisa Maria described. That's actually the data, right? People want to know what's the lived experience, what's actually happening, because it gives you a sense of strategy that then is something that's really, or should be very interesting to funders. Often we find it's not, but that's maybe a webinar for another day. And so part of the question I'm now asking, and I really got in trouble, I think, with some colleagues, is why? Why have the data? Why have the analysis or the evaluation? So much of what we're working on has already been proven. So much of what we're working on, right now we have reports on each of our shelves that prove everything that's inside of our strategies. It doesn't mean you don't want to do evaluation. Doesn't mean you don't want to have data analysis. But I get really concerned about us in the nonprofit world writ large, and especially in philanthropic spaces, who want the constant cycle of evaluation and data analysis to prove things that are already proven, right? And it makes me wonder, and I saw someone in the chat talk about this sort of white supremacist construct that we're working inside of and against. And in some ways, the question is asked it's designed to answer those questions in ways that don't actually advance the work. So I first want us to answer the question, do we need the data? And do we need the analysis? I don't believe there's anything in Dominique or Lisa Maria's work that they need to analyze any more than they already have, right? They could write those reports today. They've already written a dozen of them. I think we should really be interrogating ourselves around what that looks like, and are there different ways for us to set this up? This is a debate and a conversation we're having inside of Foundation for Louisiana as we speak. Like, what is the way for us to make these grants in a way that doesn't require so much of people because they're already overwhelmed with the work itself? And we're not sure that even answering the question gets us different answers, because so much of the work that we fund and are engaged in is generational work. You may not see a change for 7 years, right? Or 12 years. That's some of the stuff that we're now touting. Look at New Orleans, look how great we've done this work. It has been 15 years, or in some cases more, of work. And so I'm not sure if I'm helping any at all, Sarah, but sometimes I think we should answer the question first, do we even need it? And then when we do, really deal with the tough work of designing something that looks different than typical data and evaluation models. They're not working for our communities.
Thanks for that, Flozell. And I want to kind of tag along a comment that was made in our chat about, we think about the space of philanthropy, that it is often not very inclusive or not very representative of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in that it is often more white-led, and majority number of people in those spaces are white people. And I'm curious to hear from you, Flozell and Sebastian, thinking about how race can play a role no matter where we are in this work. And if you could share your experiences as a Black person working in the philanthropic space, and have you seen ways in which your race limits the support that you're able to get for the causes that you are concerned about? And I'll start with Sebastian, and then I'll come to Flozell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any Black professional will tell you that there's a constant, or can be this constant dialogue in your mind. Am I here because they needed to hire a Black person, and because of the person I am, or am I here because of my expertise and what I can offer the organization? I think that one of the ways in which, and I think this goes back to the point I was making about the ways that the nonprofit industrial sector is structured. I think there are ways in which things that Black people and communities have been saying for generations and decades about the need to fund police departments differently, or the need to eliminate cash bail, or the need to address fines and fees sounds like expertise and sounds informed by research and sounds disinterested coming out of a white person rather than a Black person. And so I do think that that is something that, particularly in philanthropic spaces, can be a challenge. And then overall, I think is that people fund what they know. I think the background that you come from, the theory of change that you've invested your own career in, leads you to think that, you know, this is how you create change in the world. And so I think that when you are selecting staff for your foundation, if you have an overemphasis on people who've worked in government or have done technical assistance or have run a traditional nonprofit, that the theory of change then becomes more of that same. So I do think it's really critically important that we bring more people who have direct experience into philanthropy, who are directly impacted by the systems that we're trying to change, to provide that perspective about, you know, the things that honestly you miss. I think that you can kind of see it in the example of criminal justice funding after Ferguson. There was a big emphasis, and I think some of this came from the top, on training, technical assistance, and getting the people who are already invested as system actors to do their jobs better. And in a lot of cases, that did work. You saw numbers going down. Like, I think youth prison is one of the bigger success lights in terms of criminal justice reform. But you don't see the disparities go away. And part of the reason you're not seeing the disparities go away is because you don't have people at the table who are pointing out what are those points of disparate treatment. How can we really address how the system has become a net widener for Black and brown youth? And so I think that it goes back to the question about, you know, who is you know, addressing these issues and is seen as disinterested versus biased. Do you have the right people at the table when you're making those decisions? And are you providing space for, you know, the people of color on your staff to feel like they can show up authentically and be their full selves at work?
Yeah, and I would, in full agreement with what Sebastian said, and I would add for organizations like myself, I mean, so you have a couple of things. One is we're not endowed, and so we're in this constant cycle of raise money, make grants, raise money, make loans. And what I find is the same experience that some of our grantees report. It's much more difficult to make the case for what is a Black-led organization. I have colleagues who frequently get funded off of ideas. I mean, sort of literally back of the napkin, like, you know, went to dinner with some old colleagues, and next thing you know, they've got a $1 million startup grant to do something amazing. And I have to engage in 6 months of cultivation, making the case, multiple interviews, you know, jumping through the rings of fire. And I'm so used to it, it becomes a source of pride, right? So when I get with my Black-led philanthropic colleagues around the country, and I have to do it around the country because there are hardly any here in Louisiana, we have the same stories, no matter whether they're running $1 billion organization or one like ours that doesn't have an endowment. There's always this performative way that we have to show up and behave, and that we have to, as someone put in the chat, it's like we're constantly organizing inside of our organizations to push as far as we can to move the work based on a real sort of racial and gender equity analysis. Which is real. The other thing that goes to this and why it's really difficult is in Louisiana, I am a part of almost every philanthropic organization you can imagine, because you do the thing, you know, peer organizations. And I can only think of one Black-led philanthropy in New Orleans that's in this work. And I cannot think of a single other across the entire state. And that's among a list of hundreds of foundations, hundreds. Right, many of them smaller family and community foundations, some of them very large, at least by Louisiana standards, private and community foundations. And so you don't have space to engage in mission critical strategy work with your colleagues when it comes to the deep racial work, because often folks just don't understand what your analysis is, or even where we have allies or accomplices, they have serious limitations. I've had more than a few colleagues recently say, oh God, you guys are taking down the Confederate monuments and doing this equitable community development work. We can't do that. We can't participate. Our board won't allow us. Our funders won't allow us. And so there's some real limitations, and we end up carrying a different kind of burden in the work than we would if the situation were different. And the last thing I'll mention to your question, well, while we are on this call, NCRP just released a report about Black funding denied, community foundation support for Black communities, where they are proving again that in local communities, the communities that get the least amount of funding and certainly the least amount of flexible funding, operational support and what have you, are Black-led nonprofits. And so we see this time and time again. I think there's a real opportunity to maybe do what someone said in the chat, and that is to do some more work around accountability. I'm loath to say that should be done by grantees because it puts you more at risk, but we do need to have a conversation about what that looks like inside of philanthropy.
Thanks so much, Flozell. I want to ask my last question to Dominique and Lisa Maria before we have Sarah field some of the group questions or the group questions in the chat. So Dominique, can you just tell us, we think about, 2020 has brought a lot of focus to the present moment. We have coronavirus, we have its threat to Black and Brown communities in the free world, as well as in our jails, prisons, and detention centers. We have this moment of an American spring sparked by the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and unfortunately just recently a killing in Kenosha. I'm from Milwaukee, and Kenosha is right down the street, basically. And then countless other people who have been harmed by police violence, as well as thinking about leading up to this November 3rd election and the importance of people participating in that election. Zooming out, and this kind of leads us up to this question I want to ask you, Dominique and Lisa Maria, is if we are successful in our work today, what do our communities look like 5 years from now?
Successful communities in New Orleans, to me, looks like a community, not a street with an Airbnb or a lot of gentrification on it. It looks like a community. You see children outside playing. You see children outside football games, basketball games, riding bikes. That's what it looks like to me. You also see fathers outside with families and interacting with their children. And most importantly, you see people happy. You see people happy. You find alternate opportunities or alternate ways to rehabilitate people and not incarcerate people. You see opportunities for law enforcement officers and the justice system to keep families connected instead of tear them apart. You see ways where people are focusing on the well-being of the children. And I mean the holistic well-being of the children. And that starts from the parents. A lot of the children in New Orleans, we are being raised, or we were raised by broken parents. And some of our parents never received any type of mental support. Growing up in New Orleans, you're told whatever happens in my house stays in my house. And so it's still like that now. And so breaking that cycle helps to get the services that children need to thrive. And I think once people who are entering these spaces to help these children understand the culture that has been passed down to these children, starting with their last names, then we can become a better community, because children are born into these last names and thrown into some of the roughest projects in the city. And then you have people come in and want to try to save these children and know nothing about it, and are given the funds to do it. So for me, our future is thriving because you see children outside playing within the communities. Children are being supported by people who are from those communities and have develop ways and opportunities for those communities to thrive. And city leaders and local officials are partnering and working with these people to make those communities better.
Thanks, Dominique. Lisa Maria, same question for you. If we're successful in our work today, what do our communities look like 5 years from now?
And thinking through some of the different levels that we work with ALAS and that we've discussed today. I mean, if we start with the prior question of organizations, philanthropic organizations, instead of philanthropic organizations asking us for data, what if they ask us what data they need to collect and they help us learn how to collect it? I mean, we could tell you what's the next step, and I mean, students could tell you what's the next step, and together we could work on creating systems to further that, instead of, as Dominique said, you know, we could like write several reports as we do and mold it to that. But what if they were to mold to what we're doing? And what that would result in would be that if systems work together that way, if it wasn't hierarchical, one-sided, you know, redoing a capitalist structure, but actually communal together as peers, systems could work together to provide the supports. I mean, if you look at what Sarah was saying with relationships between schools and justice systems have figured out how to report truancy. So if we can go in that direction, could we go in the opposite direction? Could schools support students so that they're not in the system, as opposed to contribute, you know, instead of going this direction, what if we go the opposite way? And then when I think about educators, educators are supported, and educators have resources and community partners that we're working together to refer students and strengthen what educators are able to do, because educators are working incredibly hard. It doesn't make educators specialists in all fields by any means, but there's true opportunity for collaboration when everyone has the same goals and everyone wants the same thing. And we're falling a little short of that, so we can live into that. And then I think for students, what it means is access. It means there wouldn't be people in jail pre-trial. There wouldn't be people without legal representation in any court. And the result of that would be that our youth are the ones who are redesigning the systems, changing them, structuring them, and leading them as of now, not even in 5 years, but right now, because as we have all affirmed, but our systems don't always affirm this, that it's true, the person closest to the problem is the person with the solution. So what if that person is at the helm of deciding what happens next? And that doesn't even take 5 years. We can do that now in 2020.
Thank you both. Want to loop in Sarah to share some of the questions that might have been asked in our chat box for the panelists.
Yeah, this is all so good. So we have a lot of different questions. One of the first questions that came into us were conversation about, you know, how do we flip the percentage of funding for criminal justice or criminal legal system organizations, like flip the funding from 90% white-led organizations to like 10% Black-led and founded organizations. And also and so I think that that's a conversation for all of us, but I also think specifically this second part of the question is about how grantees can organize among themselves to challenge philanthropy and to, you know, create power shifts and do better.
Yeah. So I think it's a great idea. One of the things I would recommend writ large is to think about the advocacy organizations that are doing accountability work with philanthropy. Again, NCRP comes to mind. I would check out their website, look at some of their reports. A lot of the framing and the analysis is already there, and I think local communities can sort of adapt some of that and make it their own so that you can do some acceleration on it. I also think, and I haven't quite figured out how to do this in a way that protects the grantees and nonprofits, because there is, at human nature, there's some risk involved. Not that we all aren't engaged in deep amount of risk because of the work we love, but one has to adjust for that. I think locally, one of the things we did 5 years ago in honor of the 10-year commemoration of Katrina and the amazing work that was done across the region was create something called the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. And we actually have an intention around interrogating ourselves. These are both local and national funders who want to be inside of these conversations and really hear from community what are the best practices and things that we should be doing. I would encourage local organizations to be in touch with us through the Funders Network with their ideas, especially the kind of analysis that looks at a racial equity agenda. Where are our resources going? And not just whether they're Black-led or Brown-led organizations, but what kind of work are they doing? So that there can be a real focus on racial and social justice.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question? Sebastian or anybody?
I think another part of that is what questions are you asking on your grant application? Are you asking about the number of Black and brown people you have on staff or in senior leadership? Are you asking for an analysis of how directly impacted or Black and brown communities will particularly be affected by the work that you're funding in the application? So I think part of it is that people respond to the incentive structure of the grant application. So if that's something that your organization values, how do you add that to your application so that you're getting what you want to see? And I think another part is, and I think it's a great question that Monica asked in the webinar chat, which is like, what can white-led organizations do? It's don't think of an intervention or a strategy and then go find Black partners. It's like you should be at the table with those partners from the beginning, having them plot that strategy with you, and then you're also sharing your network and your expertise. Like, don't go into the meeting with the grant manager and talk about your sub-grantees if they're not at the table with you discussing the work, and so that you're demonstrating the value that they've added to the process. I think that is a part that's often missed.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to a question that was asked in the chat, and I would love for Dominique and Lisa Maria to talk about it. But how can white-led nonprofits or white-led nonprofit organizations support Black and Brown-led grassroots groups in their fundraising efforts? And Dominique and Lisa Maria had started to say some things, but I think there's more to say.
So that's the biggest thing for us. Invite us to the table in the beginning. When you are thinking of a plan or a fundraising opportunity, we need to be there present with you. Because we're so devoted in our community, we love partnering with you. You'll always see Bree and myself, even our parents will be out there working and helping DBI. I mean, we are a true community organization, and it hurts us when people who are just built or just started their organization a month ago or a year ago come and try to take our ideas and bring them into our communities and make them thrive because they have money to do so. Well, in turn, you not only get frowned upon from us, but the community despises you too. I mean, people go hard behind DBI because we impact so many girls. And so the thing about that is, if you don't feel like we have the capacity to do something, then you put us in the position to give us the capacity to do it. So when you're working with us in terms of fundraising, bring your ideas to us. Let us work together to better the community. Don't try to do something in our community without us.
I would say when it comes to not only fundraising, but there's many other aspects of operation that are nebulous or hard to learn. I mean, if we're doing the work all the time, how are we figuring out the accounting? How are we figuring out the CRM and how the emails get to everyone? I mean, I'm working with teachers and students and parents, not with spreadsheets all day. And so, I mean, there's more creative, I mean, funding is first and foremost what's lacking, but there's also many things that go into being able to collect the data to get the funding that are missing pieces. So if an organization, if a person has expertise in something or is further along in their path, even making connections to the people who have funded other organizations before, or what is the fellowship that you've been in that has helped you sharpen those skills that we could apply to that is funded, you know. I think there's even more than money, there's really concrete ways to partner. One really obvious thing for us right now, and I think could be true for Dominique and for any organization, is that there's initiatives within what we're doing that we could use help with. So we're looking for attorneys to represent kids pro bono. If we had somebody who would be willing to organize that process for us and take it off of our plate, that could be much more robust, or interpreters for court. Right now we're looking for artists to donate pieces for an art auction to try to raise funds. So, I mean, it can be very creative, but I think I would like to reinforce what Dominique said as well. It's about asking, what do you need? What do you want? How can we help? As opposed to saying, oh, come in later and we'll tell you, you know, and that might not be aligned to where the need is, or it might just create more work or a different line of work that actually takes us away from what we're here to do.
Something that also came up, and so if Dominique and Lisa Maria, if you're able to multitask this, I would love it if y'all would drop your information about your, I think DBI has a webinar coming up. Please drop that information into the chat. There are two of them. One is going to be on this coming Monday. Is that August 31st, I think? And then Lisa Maria, share, you know, anything, your website, any of that stuff that you would like to share. And then I will pivot and smartly ask a question to Sebastian and Flozell about if there are any, if people are seeing any trends within foundations that are focused on establishing initiatives to address key issues related to racial inequity, or address racial inequity.
Yeah, we're seeing a few things, and I think you know, one of the things that I love that I think we all saw recently was what's her name, Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, taking her extraordinary wealth, and it's no surprise she would do some philanthropy. What was shocking was the way she did it. Large amounts of money to anchor organizations, large and small, traditional and non-traditional, and giving them the money, no strings attached. This is unheard of. This does not happen in philanthropy or anywhere else for that matter. And I am thinking that and she deeply informed and advised by Black radical, brown radical leaders around the country who she sought out to say, what have we been doing wrong? What's the real opportunity here? So I think I'm hoping that that is a trend. We're certainly seeing our friends at the Association of Black Foundation Executives continue to push the work to not only get philanthropy to acculturate itself towards a racial equity agenda, but for it to show up at every layer of the work, including with whom they make their investments and who they engage in contractual work with and things of that nature. And last thing I'll mention that I've seen that many of you may have seen is Ford and other foundations using some creative financing mechanisms to really double the amount of money that they're going to put on the streets in the next 18 months. I think those are the kind of things that we hear from our grantees and we think about ourselves, like what can large philanthropy and even smaller philanthropy do to creatively put more money on the streets, have fewer strings attached, and to actively fund Black and brown-led organizations?
I would say, you know, two things. I think, you know, internally at Arnold Ventures, you know, I think the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and the crisis of racial injustice are definitely causing us to rethink and also deepen our strategy and think about how we can impact better Black and brown communities, but also do that work with community. So we're committed in our advocacy space and also in all of our spaces to a bipartisan approach, because if you look at the last 4 years, domination of conservative lawmakers and legislatures at at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level. Our approach was like, we can't wait until, everyone in power agrees with us on everything, because people have issues right now that we need to be addressing. And so one of the things we're thinking about is how do we continue to invest in bipartisan ways, but also invest in community and the ability of community to advocate for themselves, because ultimately in the advocacy space, we're responding to what is happening. You're not setting that agenda. In response to the uprisings around George Floyd, internally at our organization, we decided that each employee would be able to give $5,000 to an organization of their choice that was addressing racial justice. And so that was a different way of funding for us, and one that was really encouraging to our staff, and one that I hope we'll see more of at other large philanthropies, which are geared towards giving out really big dollar donations, but could also be having an impact at the community level and devolving some of that decision-making in ways that make it more democratic and allow everyone's expertise to be leveraged. And then the third thing, I think this goes to the point that Flozell was making about Black philanthropy. Many Black people who have managed to acquire wealth are coming from sectors, entertainment, sports, where there isn't a strong philanthropy tradition. Or if there is that kind of philanthropy tradition, it's around giving back directly to your community, which is powerful, and we definitely need more of that. But I'm seeing a lot of the newer Black philanthropists wanting to invest in systems change. If you look at what LeBron James is doing with More Than a Vote, if you look at what Jay-Z and Meek Mill are doing with Reform Alliance, they are looking at opportunities to change laws and change hearts and minds, and having not only those perspectives, so new perspectives in the philanthropic space influencing their peers, but also the impact that makes on regular Black and brown people to say that philanthropy is something that is for our communities, and we should have a voice in how these dollars are spent and not just be the recipient of them.
Yeah. And so I realize that we are at time, but there were, if y'all would allow us a couple extra minutes for a couple of last questions. There was one question about how do you recommend that Black and brown led organizations get noticed by funders and get then funded by funders?
Well, I like a couple of things. I'm a big fan of earned media, right? I'm thinking about how to tell your story, get media attention, certainly using social media. I think Dominique said it perfectly. Your folks go hard, right? Good organizations have fan bases, so to speak, people who will speak to the work, getting them involved in attention campaigns and talking about your work, tagging philanthropy, because often there's not some insidious strategy against you. Often it's some overworked program officer or somebody who just can't get to the sort of landscape analysis or close enough to the ground to understand what's going on. And you want to do that. And I'm also just a fan of the old school, reach out and touch somebody. Send an email, make the phone call, harass us a little bit, because sometimes you'll find that the squeaky wheel absolutely does get the oil. And that goes, that's attached to some of the other strategies we talked about with regard to how you narrate your strategy and really give some excitement around the work. I know it's a pain in the behind trying to constantly do that stuff, but I haven't seen anything else work. So, there always is a need for that. And Dominique has a question.
So that can also be a little discouraging. And sometimes, we can reach out and build a relationship over 6 months to a year and then get denied. And then you go through a depression phase because you work so hard and it takes some time for you to get back up and get out there. So how does that work for folks like us who work so hard on applications or work so hard on building relationships to be denied, and then to see that you give money to people who we know are not doing the work? What can we do?
I'll let Sebastian get in on this, but one of the things that is a practice at FFL, and we get a lot of lot of criticism for this, Dominique, to be honest with you. But because we don't have large grant making cycles in a normal sort of endowment cycle, right? We invite people in because we've been told before, don't engage me in this conversation if you almost aren't absolutely sure that we're going to get funding. And so we're really deliberate about that. It presents some real challenges, as Lisa Maria mentioned earlier, because it feels like exclusion. And so we do a lot of work to try to understand the landscape and be really clear with people to say, well, we're really looking for a policy agenda that does X, Y, and Z. And if you're not in that frame, we will be really honest with you so we don't waste your time. It still doesn't help with your issue around the need for funding, but we at least don't want to waste people's time. I think your point is really well taken. And I'm hoping more and more philanthropy aren't bringing folks all the way through the cycle and still denying them. But that's not a practice that we have. So maybe, I don't know, Sebastian, what are you guys thinking about that?
I think it's definitely a problem. And I think that in some ways, the larger your philanthropy, the bigger the problem is, because the more levels of approval you need to go through in order to get a grant approved. And I think that it does, you know, my answer to the overall question is definitely develop those relationships with your program officer, and see the relationship with your program officer as separate from denial or approval of the grant. That you want them to have an understanding of your work and believe in your work outside, you know, will I get this approved or not? I think that's kind of the biggest thing. And I think that it's just like you kind of never know when or how an opportunity will, like the stars will align in terms of the internal politics or approval processes in the foundation to create those opportunities to get approval down the line. So I think the relationship building is really important. But I think that's one of the fundamental critiques of philanthropy around kind of wasting time. You have to both be really clear about what your strategy is and what is likely to get approved. And I think that it also pushes against, it's a balancing act because you also don't want to be so prescriptive that you're closing the door to opportunities and new strategies, and the possibility of new, different ways of working. But yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think it's a balance, and it's incumbent on philanthropists to figure that out and think about how much of this can I do on my end to make this as painless as possible for the person who I'm trying to support.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for this dialogue. It's such a privilege for me to be able to call on colleagues and friends to have this discussion. And we think about, somebody had shared this idea that bridges are built through conversations. And we think about those bridges being built to bring us through difficult situations, to get us over troubled waters. I really do value and appreciate you all sharing your time with us today to have this conversation. Just in terms of a quick recap, there were so many beautiful gems that were kind of dropped during today's conversation. You know, Lisa Maria talked to us about how there aren't public defenders in immigration court. Sebastian shared how, you know, public policy can change lives. Flozell reminded us that storms of racism, gender inequity, issues of mistreatment for the LGBTQ+ communities have been impacting Louisiana's for years, well before any storm has come to this space. And Dominique reminding us the beauty that can be in the vision of our kids just simply playing and having happiness and joy in our communities when we are successful in today's work. We also, you know, learned how that advocacy has to be in partnership with community, and that lived experiences is just as important as academic or professional ones. Flozell talked to us about how noticing, you know, growing up in the childhood that their men were disappearing, and we think about how our carceral systems have been removing pivotal people from people's lives, and just thinking that as we get into this grant making space, thinking through this idea of what role does data play? Do we need data? What is the wrong way to make a grant? How are we developing the capacities within these organizations that we're looking for them to have? And so almost having a dual approach of we're looking for these capacities, but at the same time, we have to be funding and supporting in some type of level to develop those capacities in the first place. Lisa Maria, you know, questioned this idea of, you know, let's give people food, but not ask why they're hungry. Like that framework doesn't make sense. So we need to have those additional conversations to understand what is the root of the problem and generate a consensus of understanding that a problem does actually exist. This has been, so illuminating and such a great honor for me to sit back and listen to you all talk about this impact of work on Black and Brown communities. Thank you for everyone for joining us for this conversation. We'll send out a recording for those that weren't able to join us amongst your network that you want to send this to. Really do hope that for those that might be in the site of a storm or impact of the fires, that you're staying safe and you're staying well as we're navigating the safety of this pandemic, that you all stay healthy as well as your friends and your families. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you next time.